40,000 soldiers moved through the darkness toward a single battalion of barely 1,000 men. The hills north of Yultong shook under artillery fire as midnight split the sky open in flame. It was April 22, 1951, and the Great Spring Offensive had begun. Chinese divisions advanced in disciplined waves, determined to shatter United Nations lines and drive south once more. Against that tidal force stood the Filipino 10th Battalion Combat Team. They were exhausted, outnumbered nearly 40 to 1, and positioned on exposed ridgelines miles from reinforcement. Yet retreat was not an option. If their line collapsed, the breach could unravel the entire sector. What happened on those hills would become one of the most extraordinary defensive stands of the Korean War, proof that resolve, leadership, and discipline can defy even overwhelming numbers. The path to Yultong began almost a year earlier. On June 25, 1950, North Korean forces surged across the 38th parallel in a coordinated invasion of South Korea. Backed by China and the Soviet Union, their objective was swift unification of the peninsula under communist control. Seoul fell quickly. Defensive positions crumbled. The world watched as a regional conflict threatened to ignite a broader Cold War confrontation. In response, the United Nations Security Council authorized military intervention, one of the first major collective security actions of the modern era. Nations from across the globe committed forces to defend South Korea. Among them was the Philippines, a nation barely 5 years removed from its own liberation after World War II. Its decision to send troops was not symbolic. It was a statement of solidarity in defense of freedom. On August 7, 1950, President Elpidio Quirino, with approval from Congress, deployed 7,420 Filipino troops under the Philippine Expeditionary Forces to Korea, known as PEFTOK. It was a bold move for a young republic still rebuilding its own cities and economy. The first unit to arrive was the 10th Battalion Combat Team, composed of 1,303 enlisted men and 64 officers. They landed in Bisan on September 19th, stepping into a conflict defined by brutal terrain and shifting battle lines. Originally intended to operate American tanks, the battalion had to adapt when those armored vehicles never materialized. Instead, they were reorganized into a heavy weapons infantry unit. Flexibility became their strength. They trained relentlessly, mastering mortar, artillery coordination, and anti-tank operations in preparation for battles they knew would test them beyond expectation. By early 1951, the Korean War had entered a volatile phase. Chinese forces, having intervened months earlier, launched massive offensives designed to overwhelm United Nations troops through sheer manpower and relentless pressure. The campaign, known as the Great Spring Offensive, aimed to break the Allied line and regain lost ground. Entire divisions were committed simultaneously across multiple sectors. One of those sectors was near Yultong, north of Yongqing, where the 10th Battalion held defensive positions alongside American and Allied units. The terrain was unforgiving: steep hills, narrow ridgelines, and limited cover. Control of elevation meant control of momentum. If these hills fell, the surrounding line could fracture. The battalion knew the stakes. They were not merely holding ground. They were holding the integrity of a defensive front that stretched for miles. Shortly after midnight on April 22nd, Chinese artillery began pounding the hills. The barrage was intense and methodical. designed to soften defenses before infantry advanced. Shells tore through earthworks and sent shockwaves across defensive trenches. Communications crackled under pressure as officers relayed orders through chaos. Then came the infantry waves, thousands of soldiers moving through darkness toward Filipino positions. Mortar teams from the 10th Battalion responded with calculated precision. Artillery observers called in coordinates. Rifles and machine guns ignited the night with steady bursts. The battle became a violent symphony of explosions, shouted commands, and disciplined return fire. Despite being vastly outnumbered, the battalion's defensive coordination prevented immediate breakthrough. The first waves stalled under concentrated resistance. But the scale of the offensive soon became clear. 4 Chinese divisions, approximately 40,000 men, had been directed toward this sector. The numerical imbalance was staggering. Against them stood a battalion barely exceeding 1,000 soldiers. Yet the 10th Battalion did not collapse under that realization. Training and cohesion replaced panic. Defensive fire remained controlled rather than frantic. Still, pressure mounted. To the east, the Turkish brigade began losing ground under sustained assault. Their withdrawal exposed the Filipino flank, creating a dangerous corridor the Chinese could exploit. Encirclement loomed as a real possibility. In war, a breached flank can transform defense into disaster within minutes. Lieutenant Colonel Dionisio Ojeda recognized the threat immediately. If the eastern flank fell completely, the battalion risked being surrounded and annihilated. Reinforcements were unavailable. Time was non-existent. Ojeda made a decisive call. Cooks, clerks, and support personnel were ordered to take up rifles and fortify the exposed sector. There would be no distinction between combat and support roles. Every man became a rifleman. Supported by light tanks and artillery, the improvised defensive unit moved into position. When Chinese forces attempted to exploit the breach, they encountered unexpected resistance. The eastern line stiffened instead of collapsing. That decision, rapid, bold, and necessary, prevented immediate encirclement. Meanwhile, pressure intensified on the western flank as well. The Puerto Rican 65th Infantry Regiment began pulling back under heavy attack, further widening the threat. On a hill overlooking Yultong, a platoon commanded by Lieutenant Jose Archerga refused to yield despite mounting isolation. Their elevated position was critical. Losing it would grant the enemy direct access to defensive depth. Under relentless fire, Arciaga's men held firm, slowing Chinese advancement just long enough for a countermeasure to be organized. Their resistance bought minutes, and in battle, minutes determined survival. Captain Conrado Yap led the counterattack to relieve the trapped platoon. Advancing uphill into intense resistance, Filipino soldiers moved with disciplined aggression. The clash was close and unforgiving. Smoke, muzzle flashes, and shouted commands blurred into chaos. Yet the counterattack succeeded. The trapped platoon was extracted, and the hill reclaimed. The line stabilized, but at tremendous cost. Both Lieutenant Archiaga and Captain Yap were killed during the engagement. Their sacrifice sealed the breach and preserved the battalion's defensive integrity. Leadership in that moment was not theoretical. It was embodied in men who moved forward when retreat might have seemed easier. As dawn broke on April 23rd, the battlefield lay scarred and smoking. Chinese forces continued pressing forward, determined to overwhelm the defenders. Ojeda understood that passive defense would eventually crumble under sustained pressure. He ordered a second counterattack supported by M24 light tanks. The roar of engines cut through the lingering haze as armor advanced across cratered terrain. The maneuver was bold and unexpected. Chinese formations, anticipating continued static resistance, were caught off guard. The sudden shift from defense to offense disrupted their assault rhythm and forced them into reactive positions. The armored push changed the rhythm of the battlefield. Where hours earlier the Chinese assault had surged with coordinated momentum, now hesitation crept into advancing ranks. The M24 light tanks rolled forward in deliberate formation, their cannons firing into clustered infantry formations, attempting to reorganize. Filipino riflemen advanced alongside the armor, clearing contested positions and reclaiming ground that had nearly fallen. The decision to counterattack at dawn was not merely tactical, it was psychological. It signaled that the 10th Battalion was not on the verge of collapse. They were still capable of striking back. That shift forced the enemy to reassess their momentum. Assault formations designed to overwhelm static defenders were now reacting to mobile resistance. In battle, tempo often determines outcome, and for the first time since midnight, tempo favored the defenders. Yet the counterattack was not about reclaiming territory indefinitely. The broader strategic picture demanded coordination with Allied forces positioned further south. Orders arrived to conduct a controlled withdrawal and link up with the U.S. 3rd Infantry Division. Withdrawal under pressure is one of the most dangerous maneuvers in combat. It requires discipline stronger than aggression. The 10th Battalion executed it with cohesion. Units rotated positions methodically, covering each other's movement. Wounded soldiers were carried through uneven terrain, while artillery provided suppressive fire. No panic fractured the line, no collapse followed. The hills of Yultong were left behind not in defeat, but in completion of mission. They had held long enough. They had absorbed the assault. They had denied breakthrough. The cost of that stand was measured in lives. 15 Filipino soldiers were killed in action. 26 were wounded. 14 were listed as missing. Against them, Chinese and North Korean casualties were estimated at approximately 500. The numbers reflect the intensity of the engagement, but they cannot capture its human weight. Behind each casualty was a story interrupted. Families thousands of miles away, unaware that their sons were fighting against impossible odds in frozen Korean hills. For a battalion so heavily outnumbered, survival itself became extraordinary. The disparity in casualties underscored not only courage, but disciplined fire control and tactical awareness under immense pressure. Strategically, the impact extended beyond the immediate battlefield. The stand at Yultong allowed the U.S. 3rd Infantry Division to withdraw in orderly fashion rather than in chaotic retreat. A fractured withdrawal could have opened corridors for deeper Chinese penetration into South Korean territory. Instead, the Allied line stabilized. The Great Spring Offensive, designed to shatter defenses through massed force, failed to achieve decisive breakthrough in that sector. Sometimes victory in war is not measured in captured ground, but in prevented collapse. At Yultong, collapse was prevented. In the weeks that followed, Communist forces began ceasefire negotiations after sustaining heavy losses across multiple sectors. Fighting would continue for 2 more years, but the momentum of that spring offensive had been blunted. The Korean War entered a grinding phase of hilltop engagements. trench warfare and artillery duels that echoed the stalemates of earlier conflicts. The lines hardened near the 38th parallel, eerily close to where the war had begun. The battleground shifted from rapid advances to entrenched endurance. Yultong became one of the engagements cited as evidence that Allied lines could hold under overwhelming pressure. For the Philippines, the Korean War represented one of its earliest international military commitments as an independent nation. Over the course of the conflict, 7,420 Filipino soldiers served under PEFTOK. Of those, 113 were killed, 313 wounded, 15 missing, and 41 taken prisoner. The commitment was substantial for a country still rebuilding from occupation and war. It was not merely participation, it was sacrifice. Units rotated through Korea across multiple deployments, maintaining presence through some of the harshest phases of the conflict. Yultong became the defining chapter within that broader contribution. Captain Conrado Yap's sacrifice did not fade into obscurity. Decades after the guns fell silent, he was posthumously awarded the Taejuk Medal, South Korea's highest military decoration for bravery in combat. The recognition served as more than ceremony. It symbolized enduring gratitude from a nation whose survival had been shaped by international solidarity. Major Maximo Young, another member of the 10th Battalion, was also honored for his heroism during the conflict. These decorations bridged generations, reminding both nations that sacrifice does not expire with time. Today, a monument stands within the War Memorial of Korea in Seoul, honoring the Filipino soldiers who fought for South Korea's defense. Visitors pass its engraved tributes, many unaware of the imbalance faced at Yultong. The monument does not depict vast armies. It represents commitment, the willingness of a smaller nation to send its sons into distant battlefields in defense of shared principles. Stone and bronze preserve memory where silence might otherwise swallow it. The U.S. command gave the 10th Battalion a name after the battle, the Fighting Filipinos. It was not ceremonial language. It was acknowledgement earned through disciplined resistance and decisive counterattack. Reputation among Allied forces carries weight. In multinational coalitions, trust is forged through shared hardship. The actions at Yultong strengthened that trust. They demonstrated reliability under pressure and leadership under chaos. Leadership during the battle proved decisive. Lieutenant Colonel Dionisio Ojeda's rapid decisions prevented encirclement and maintained cohesion when flanks faltered. He assessed the battlefield dynamically, understanding that delay or hesitation could prove catastrophic. His willingness to deploy support personnel into combat positions reflected both urgency and confidence in training. Leadership in such moments is not theoretical. It is immediate and consequential. It determines whether units fracture or endure. Equally significant was the principle that every soldier is a soldier first. The cooks and clerks who reinforced the eastern flank had undergone the same foundational training as infantrymen. When called upon, they responded without hesitation. That cohesion underlined a fundamental military truth. Preparedness across roles strengthens resilience. In crises, specialization dissolves into shared responsibility. The terrain itself amplified danger. Steep hills funneled movement into predictable paths, making elevation critical. Control of high ground allowed defenders to direct fire effectively and monitor enemy advancement. Losing even a single ridge could expose entire sectors. The platoon that held its hill under Lieutenant Archiega did more than delay the enemy. It preserved leverage. Chinese tactics relied heavily on numerical superiority and human wave assaults designed to overwhelm through sustained pressure. Against such mass, disciplined fire control became a force multiplier. The 10th Battalion did not exhaust ammunition recklessly. They maintained controlled bursts, maximizing effect while conserving resources. Training overrode fear. The imbalance remains striking. 40,000 soldiers directed toward a battalion of barely 1,000. 4 divisions pressing against a single defensive line, yet the line did not disintegrate. Numbers alone did not dictate outcome. Cohesion, leadership, and timing shaped it. The Korean War itself became known as the Forgotten War in many countries, overshadowed by the scale of World War II and the later turmoil of Vietnam. Yet it marked the first major armed conflict of the Cold War. The ideological divisions that defined decades of global tension crystallized on Korean soil. Yultong was a microcosm of that larger struggle. For the soldiers who survived, the battle remained personal rather than geopolitical. It was remembered in fragments, the sound of artillery, the faces of fallen comrades, the exhaustion of holding through night. Veterans carried those memories quietly for decades, rarely seeking recognition. Their contribution was preserved in regimental histories and commemorative ceremonies rather than headlines. The ceasefire signed in 1953 did not formally end the war. It froze it. The demilitarized zone still divides North and South Korea today, one of the most heavily fortified borders in the world. The peace that exists remains guarded and fragile. The defense of sectors like Yultong helped shape that line. History often turns not on grand declarations, but on moments of stubborn resistance. A battalion refusing to yield, a commander ordering counterattack instead of retreat, a platoon holding elevation against overwhelming odds. These moments accumulate into outcomes larger than themselves. South Korea today stands as a thriving democracy and global economic power. Its survival during those early, vulnerable years was not inevitable. It was defended ridge by ridge, night by night, by soldiers from multiple nations who chose to stand rather than step back. On the hills of Yultong in April 1951, a battalion of Filipino soldiers faced overwhelming force and held their ground. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and far from home, yet they did not break. Their stand blunted an offensive, preserved a defensive line, and strengthened Allied resolve. The hills are quiet now, but the legacy remains. In that silence lies the story of the fighting Filipinos, men who stood against a sea of soldiers and proved that courage, when disciplined and united, can alter the course of war.